All right, sorry, we had our picture, and our historian gave us a lecture. We always have the historian at the beginning of our lunch at when the pictures started, which is a while back. And they were supposed to be temporary only once, but here we are. Okay. I want to thank Senators Hassan, Luhan, and Van Hollen for joining us. As if kicking 17 million people off health care to give billionaires the largest tax break in history wasn't enough, Republicans are at it again this week. Republicans are leading the charge to implement President Trump's devastating and wildly unpopular cuts that impact millions of Americans. This time, targeting local news throughout the country, including in rural areas that lack broadband and other options. To be clear, gutting bipartisan investments and hurting America's standing throughout the world is not popular. Losing access to local news, radio, and weather alerts, particularly in rural areas, is not popular. Americans rely on public broadcasting for weather alerts, and these cuts couldn't come at a worse time right now after we're seeing the devastating tragedy in Texas, and we're left with even more questions about what the cuts to the Weather Service and to FEMA, what effects they had. That's why today I called for a full-scale independent investigation into whether Trump and Secretary Noem's haphazard policy changes and job cuts delayed aid, cost lives, left our nation vulnerable to future disasters. We need a full-scale investigation. How did these cuts affect what happened in Texas? And how will they affect the rest of the country? Because we know there are going to be more weather disasters occurring from one end of the country to the other. So, I have called for this full-scale independent investigation into whether their policy changes affected Texas and how they'll affect America. I sounded the alarm on the nationwide risk and demanded a sweeping federal audit of FEMA's crippled ability to respond to disasters nationwide, thanks to this administration's heartless cuts. You know, DOGE comes along with its chainsaw approaches. They just cut, cut, cut. They have no idea what the consequences will be, and they don't give a hoot. They simply want to cut, whether it causes disasters and prevents, whether it causes disasters in the country or prevents us from dealing with natural disasters in the country. Americans must be able to count on FEMA in the moments of crisis. Every one of us has seen that in our states, the good job that FEMA has done. But the flood response in Texas exposed systemic vulnerabilities created just by natural disasters and then made much worse by political failures. We owe it to the families mourning. I see those pictures of those 26 girls. It breaks my heart. We owe it to the community still waiting for help, and to all Americans that may one day face an unforeseen disaster to determine now what went wrong and fix it before another storm strikes the country. The cuts have devastating impacts. Americans are paying the costs. Speaking of costs, Donald Trump campaigned as a president to lower costs. He said he'd lower costs on day one. But halfway through his first year, it's clear nothing could be further from the truth. And today, Americans woke up to a very troubling headline. U.S. inflation accelerated in June as Trump's tariffs pushed up prices. At a time when we should be helping the American people to recover financially, Trump is taking a wrecking ball to economic stability. Even worse, real wages are down for June. So wages are going down, costs are going up. And I've talked to a whole bunch of economists in New York and elsewhere. They think this is just the beginning of the inflation because it was caused by people front-loading, people who trade with China and other countries front-loading. But those extra supplies they bought, those extra goods they bought are gone, and now prices are going to go up and bottlenecks will increase, in their opinion. So So we have people's paychecks can't keep up, are unable to keep up as Trump's disastrous, with Trump's disastrous agenda, because it makes them pay more for groceries, electricity, and health care. It's only going to get worse because of Republican politics. Trump's trade war has been nothing but a tax on the American people, and now they're beginning to feel it. And this economic harm came before the big, ugly betrayal. And put those two together, the costs increases and cuts to the well-being of people done by the big, ugly betrayal, and now the tariffs, it's a pincer just squeezing the American people. Republicans couldn't make it any clearer. They will roll out the red carpet for billionaires and special interests, but programs American families rely on, they don't give a hoot. Again, to be clear, gutting bipartisan investments, compromising our national security, hurting America's standard throughout the world is not popular. Losing access to local news, radio, weather is not popular. These cuts that Republicans are pushing help to continually establish America as a leader, these cuts that helped America establish itself as leader on the world stage, well, now it's being filled by the vacuum these cuts create by China and Russia. It's very bad for us. So, when Republicans claim we don't have funding for these critical programs, whether it's cutting local news or cutting these foreign policy issues would help us fight China and Russia abroad, when they claim they don't have the money for it, we say bull. What about the tax cuts to the wealthy? You had the money for that. Senate Democrats are going to continue sounding the alarm on these devastating and short-sighted cuts. And now let me call on Senator Hassan. Thank you, Senator Hassan.
Thanks, Senator Schumer. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the kind of rising and high costs that the American people are facing. My constituents in New Hampshire are struggling with high costs of essentials like groceries, housing, and health care, making it harder for families to make ends meet. And that's the story all across the country. But President Trump and Republicans in Congress have decided to make life even more expensive through both tariffs and the budget bill that they recently passed into law. The President has imposed a national sales tax through these reckless tariffs, driving up the cost of food, housing, and other goods and services. In fact, just today, a new report showed that inflation is rising at a faster rate because of the President's reckless tariffs. And families know this firsthand. Beef and ice cream prices today hit new record high prices, with ground beef prices reaching an average of more than $6 per pound for the first time ever. And the Joint Economic Committee, the minority, which I lead as ranking member, has found that key baby products, the things that new parents need to buy in that first year of your new baby's life, cost 24% more today than they did before President Trump imposed his tariffs. At the same time, the recent Republican budget law not only takes health care away from millions of people, but it also drives up health care and prescription drug costs for all Americans, as premiums are going to skyrocket. And for our rural communities, the very real threat of providers closing their doors means longer drive times in those emergencies when minutes truly feel like hours. People are going to drive farther, they are going to wait longer, and they are going to pay more for their health care. The Joint Economic Committee minority found that firefighters, teachers, and truck drivers will all lose hundreds of dollars per year thanks to the President's tariffs and budget law, while the top 0.1%, that's people making over about $4 million a year, will get a $350,000 windfall. And now, making life even harder for rural Americans, the President and congressional Republicans also want to rip funding away from critical sources of information that they count on, particularly in emergencies, by defunding public TV and radio stations all across the country. These actions have a cost. and it's a cost that eclipses dollars and cents. The cost of these actions from the President and my Republican colleagues is millions of Americans losing their health care. The cost is people having to make difficult decisions between paying rent and putting food on the table because of inflation. The cost is families losing information sources in emergencies where every minute, every hour counts. And that's a price that the American people should not have to pay. With that, I'll hand it over to Senator Luhan.
Senator Luhan. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First off, as Leader Schumer reminded us, just don't forget about those families out in Texas. So many folks that lost loved ones, people still missing. More should have been done to help these families. At the same time, we lost 3 loved ones in New Mexico with some horrific flooding. Senator Heinrich and I were there in that community of Ruidoso on Friday. We also saw hundreds of homes that were lost. These are homes that survived a fire, flooding year 1, and more flooding comes year 2. Let us also not forget, as we talk about FEMA, that in the western part of America, we need to make sure there's a chapter for fire and the flooding that's going to follow for not just year 1, but for the next 10 years. Now, while all that's happening, my Republican colleagues are saying, well, they're going to take some cuts in a few places. Russell Vogel's just starting to steal money. That map behind me shows all the radio stations across the country that are about to lose funding. Think about those loved ones in Texas, in New Mexico. There were more floods and loved ones lost in New Jersey. People that depend on getting a radio signal, some kind of information to them when cell phones are not working, mobile phones are out, you can't get a message from anyone else, but it's local AM radio or public broadcasting that are still able to carry a signal to warn you to get out of your home. It's almost time for you to move. Get your stuff ready. You need to get out of there. Something's coming. And what about all of those experts that are supposed to be telling us what the weather's doing? That then touches you so that you might be able to save your life or a loved one's life or a pet's life. It's absolutely disgusting, the cuts that are taking place right now. Now, in addition to that, as Senator Hassan reminded us, what's happening with all these tariffs, these national sales tax? There's probably a lot of coffee drinkers here in this room. I see a bunch of you in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon and the evening. There's a couple coffee shops from back in New Mexico that have reached out to me to tell me how negatively these tariffs are hitting them as well. And for those of you that are buying a cup of coffee, you know that an extra $1 or $2 out of your pocket for a cup of coffee is a lot. At a time across New Mexico when every buck matters. That's the kind of nonsense that's happening. And to boot, they're just kicking farmers and ranchers in the face as well, making it harder and harder for them with the price of these inputs, the question associated with these food programs that are being taken away and devastated as well. It's just one punch to the American people after another, right in the gut. It is wrong. And it's time for our Republican colleagues to stand up to this nonsense, do the right thing, and reverse all that is happening that is so bad that is hurting the American people. We'll now recognize Senator Van Hollen from Maryland.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. It's good to be here with my colleagues to underscore the point that they are making, first and foremost, that what we're seeing on the floor this week in the Senate is another round of Republicans willing to cut services that are important to the American people in order to provide tax cuts for very wealthy Americans. That is what drives every action, including public radio stations that can deliver emergency information, including cuts to FEMA. In my state of Maryland, there are several cities that were going to receive FEMA grants to make sure they could protect themselves and their people against this kind of flooding. All of that is frozen. So that is the main theme that we're witnessing from Republicans from the Congress to the White House. There was one little bright spot of bipartisan agreement this week, and it happened in the Appropriations Committee, and that is that Republicans and Democrats unanimously voted to insist that the Trump administration and Attorney General Pam Bondi come clean in the Jeffrey Epstein case. This case is deeply disturbing, from his horrifying abuse of young women and girls to his lenient plea deal back in 2008 to questions about his death in prison. Survivors of his terrible abuse have not had closure. They have not had the full accounting that they deserve. They have not seen the accountability that's needed in this case, which is why I, along with my colleague Senator Durbin, offered the amendment in the Appropriations Committee markup this week on the bill that provides funding for the Justice Department to require, number one, that the Justice Department retain all the records and files regarding Jeffrey Epstein, that they then provide a report to the United States Congress with the files and answering critical questions that the American people deserve to get answers to, and to make sure that we move forward with full transparency and accountability. Given the fact that that was a unanimous vote, there is no reason Attorney General Bondi should wait one more day to follow that directive, to provide the documents, to provide the files, and to provide the American people with answers to those questions. It was bipartisan. It was unanimous. There's no reason to wait. We need transparency and accountability, and we need it now.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, sir. Ma'am.
Files. Why didn't you propose that while Biden was president and you had a Democrat running the DOJ?
Look, the bottom line is they should release the files now.
Does
Yes.
the change,
Yes.
Does the change to the bill with PEPFAR make any difference to the Democrats?
Look, the Republican bill keeps changing. We still know it does lots of horrible things. The rural areas that don't have their radio stations, that in many cases is the only way or the best way they can get weather warnings, is terrible. They've changed and added a small amount on the foreign aid proposal, but it still leaves an enormous vacuum that China and Russia will fill. We're going to try to improve the bill in any way we can. Yes, Sakil. Look, we are doing everything. First of all, ask the Republicans that question. We are doing everything we can to keep the bipartisan appropriations process going forward. It's what every president has done, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, and it serves the country well because people are represented and don't get hurt. When one side tries to do it all, it creates big problems. We are pushing hard to get the appropriations process continuing to move forward, and that's why we're cooperating with the bills they're putting on the floor. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. I spoke with him last night, and we'll be meeting in New York City. Yes.
Does he need to do more appropriation?
I said I talked with him last night, and I'll be meeting with him in New York. Yes.
Do more to reassure Jewish New Yorkers who are concerned about his inability to condemn the globalized intifada.
Look, what the globalized intifada means is really wrong and should be condemned, and I look forward to my discussions with Mr. Mamdani. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.